This is a hostile and political act by Amazon. Why didn't Amazon do this when the Biden administration hiked inflation to the highest level in 40 years? And I would also add that it's not a surprise because, as Reuters recently wrote, Amazon has partnered with a Chinese propaganda arm. So this is another reason why Americans should buy American. It's another reason why we are onshoring critical supply chains here at home to shore up our own critical supply chain and boost our own manufacturing here.
Jeff Bezos still a Trump supporter?
Look, I will not speak to the president's relationships with Jeff Bezos, but I will tell you that this is certainly a hostile and political action by Amazon and Secretary of
Amazon says it wants to be transparent, but Jordan Peterson says it's something far more dangerous. What happens when one of the most powerful companies in the world decides to reshape how you see prices and politics at the same time? Well, Karoline Leavitt didn't stay silent. She called it out in front of the nation, and what she said sent shockwaves through Washington. And now Jordan Peterson has entered the conversation, calling Amazon's stunt a manipulative strategy masked as moral virtue. When corporations masquerade as moral educators, he warns, you're not buying a product, you're buying a narrative. This isn't just about shipping fees, it's about psychological warfare, ideological theater, and one woman's refusal to stay quiet. It began like any ordinary White House briefing. Bland lighting, tight camera angles, and reporters checking their notes. But what Karoline Leavitt said that morning made headlines within minutes. She stepped up to the podium, looked directly into the camera, and fired the first shot. This is a hostile and political act by Amazon, she declared. Why didn't they do this when inflation hit a 40-year high under the Biden administration? The story? Amazon had quietly floated the idea of displaying tariff prices separately at checkout. Not as a footnote, not as a tooltip, but as a bold, attention-grabbing line item, suggesting to every consumer that the government's trade policy was to blame for rising costs. And that's when things got serious, because this wasn't just a pricing experiment. This was Amazon, the digital gatekeeper of the Western world, subtly shifting consumer frustration away from corporate profit margins and toward political targets. Within hours, the backlash erupted. Conservative commentators called it propaganda. Progressives praised it as honest accounting. And Jordan Peterson, he saw something deeper. This is how ideological capture begins, he said in a podcast reaction. Not through overt censorship, but through quiet insinuations that shape public perception. Peterson, known for deconstructing psychological manipulation in institutions, described Amazon's move as narrative engineering through price tags. It wasn't just what was being shown, it was why it was being shown now and who it served. Leavitt echoed that sentiment during the press conference. Americans deserve honesty, not political theater from billion-dollar platforms playing both sides of the aisle. The implication was clear. Amazon's new transparency wasn't neutral. It was a weaponized signal, a pressure tactic aimed at the Trump administration's trade policies. And the timing couldn't have been more calculated. Peterson, analyzing the layers beneath the headlines, framed it like this. If you want to control how people think, you don't need to lie. You just need to decide which truths to highlight and which ones to ignore. That's how you quietly shape behavior, without anyone realizing they're being pushed. This wasn't just an economic story, it was a cultural one. And as the firestorm grew, one thing became clear. Karoline Leavitt didn't flinch, and Jordan Peterson was only just getting started. At first glance, Amazon's plan seemed like a win for consumers. Clearer prices, no hidden fees, a breakdown of costs that would supposedly empower the buyer. But Jordan Peterson wasn't buying it. He saw something far more calculated. When an institution presents partial truth as total transparency, Peterson said, you're not being informed, you're being directed. And that direction was unmistakable. By showing tariff charges separately at checkout, Amazon wasn't just educating its customers, it was subtly assigning blame. With every click, the message would be loud and clear, the government did this to you. Peterson called it tactical transparency, a strategy that cloaks political messaging in the language of customer service. Tyranny rarely begins with lies, he explained. It begins with truths, selectively chosen, strategically emphasized, and relentlessly repeated. Let's break that down. Tariffs are real. They affect prices. But so do dozens of other variables. Inflation, labor costs, supply chain disruptions, even corporate profit strategies. Amazon wasn't highlighting those, just the one tied to trade policies it publicly opposed. That's not transparency, it's targeting. And Leavitt knew it. During her briefing, she hammered the point. Where was this honesty during the inflation crisis? Why didn't Amazon itemize the cost of gas, groceries, or shipping containers from China when prices were exploding under President Biden? Silence. Because the timing wasn't incidental, it was intentional. Peterson saw it for what it was, a psychological maneuver designed to reframe cause and effect. This is the hallmark of ideological activism, he warned. Control the narrative by controlling what gets attention and what doesn't. Not by deceiving, but by distorting. In other words, this wasn't a retail update. It was narrative engineering, using the guise of clarity to tilt perception against political targets. And the average consumer, overwhelmed by rising prices, would be none the wiser. That's the danger, Peterson argued. When corporations adopt the posture of moral arbiters, it becomes nearly impossible to tell where economics ends and propaganda begins. A business has one purpose: to sell. But when it pretends to teach, especially selectively, that's not capitalism, that's cultural programming. In the end, it's not about the tariff label. It's about what that label represents: the blurring of lines between commerce and control, information and manipulation. And as Peterson would soon make clear, the manipulation didn't stop there. Jordan Peterson often says, pay attention to what happens, but pay even closer attention to when it happens. And in Amazon's case, the timing of its tariff stunt wasn't just questionable, it was damning. Karoline Leavitt pointed out what many instinctively knew. Amazon didn't propose this move in 2021 or 2022 when inflation was ravaging the average American household. They didn't break down shipping fees or rising costs when groceries hit record highs. They stayed quiet. But now, just as the political winds began to shift and tariffs re-entered the national conversation, Amazon suddenly wanted to get honest. Why? Peterson offered a chillingly simple answer: because outrage is a currency, and Amazon decided to spend it now for maximum return. He broke it down further. Imagine a consumer seeing a $100 item suddenly listed as $80 plus $20 tariff. What's the psychological response? Blame. But blame directed not at the seller, at the system, the government, the policymakers. In this case, Trump's policies. It's not about showing you the truth, Peterson said. It's about who they want you to hate for it. Amazon could have highlighted inflationary costs under Biden, but that would have hurt the administration it increasingly aligns with in Washington and Silicon Valley. Instead, they waited. They chose their moment and their target. That's what makes this so sinister, Peterson added. This isn't economic reporting, it's narrative warfare. Leavitt called it out directly during her presser. They didn't itemize inflation under Biden, but they want to itemize tariffs under Trump. That's not transparency, that's timing, that's politics. And for Peterson, that's exactly where corporate activism becomes dangerous. When timing is used to disguise intention and intention is used to distort truth, the public loses the ability to think clearly. You are what you attend to, he warns. If a massive corporation directs your attention to this price factor at this moment, they are shaping your understanding of reality. The real power isn't in the data, it's in the decision to show you this data now and not something else. It's cognitive framing disguised as economic detail. And as Amazon's influence over online commerce continues to grow, Peterson says we must stay vigilant, not just of what's being said, but of the precise moment it's being said. When the timing lines up too perfectly with a political goal, he concluded, you're not watching capitalism, you're watching a campaign. And that campaign was only just beginning to unravel. It was just a small adjustment, a new line on your receipt, a few extra words at checkout. Tariff, $20. But Jordan Peterson saw it for what it really was, a Trojan horse. What appears to be transparency is in fact a carefully constructed ideological insertion, he explained. It doesn't just inform the consumer, sir, it programs them. To the average shopper, the message is subtle. Amazon isn't explicitly attacking any administration, they're just clarifying costs. But Peterson warned that the deeper function of this change is to transfer emotional blame. In essence, it turns a frustrated customer into an unwitting political weapon. Here's how. You buy a backpack. It says $60 plus $12 tariff. You don't see Amazon profit margins. You don't see shipping and logistics inflation. You see, the government took this from you. Peterson calls this the redirect effect. It's the psychological equivalent of a magician's sleight of hand, showing you something real while distracting you from the real culprit. If someone can control what you assign blame to, Peterson says, they don't need to control you outright. They've already shaped how you see the world. That's why Leavitt's criticism struck a chord with so many Americans. She didn't just attack the policy, she revealed the performance. This isn't economic transparency, she said. It's political theater, and Amazon's the stagehand pretending to be the usher. Peterson expanded on this metaphor. You're not just being handed a bill, you're being handed a narrative, one line item at a time. The danger isn't in the information itself, it's in the selective emphasis, the strategic omission, and the presentation that creates emotional impact without intellectual clarity. Peterson labeled this tactic narrative laundering, the process of taking a biased political agenda, dressing it up in the language of objectivity, and laundering it through a trusted platform. It's not that the price breakdown is false, he said. It's that it's being used to quietly reshape how people understand policy through emotion, not reason. Amazon doesn't need to lobby Congress directly if they can shift public anger toward the people setting tariffs. It's a long game. Win the narrative, win the policy. And as Peterson warns, once corporations learn they can emotionally engineer millions through a simple checkout interface, the playbook will only grow more sophisticated. If propaganda comes in the form of a pop-up window, he said, will anyone even recognize it? Jordan Peterson has spent years warning about the erosion of individual sovereignty in the face of rising institutional power. But what happens when the institution isn't a government? It's a trillion-dollar corporation. That's where Amazon enters the picture. Peterson's core message is simple but chilling. When a corporation decides what you should think about, and when it stops being a business, it becomes a cultural force, an unelected authority. And that's precisely what makes this tariff stunt so insidious. On the surface, Amazon sells products, but in reality, it controls an ecosystem, one that influences everything from what you see to what you buy, to how you feel about what you're paying for. And once a corporation can make you feel, Peterson warns, it can make you believe. The illusion of choice is what empowers Amazon's dominance. But as Peterson points out, the real control lies in framing, the ability to manipulate the context in which choices are made. Let's say you're deciding whether to support tariffs. If every product you see online is labeled with an added tariff fee over time, you start to associate economic pain with that policy, not through debate, not through research, but through sheer repetition. It's not persuasion, Peterson explains. It's repetition, it's exposure, and over time, it becomes belief. That's how the corporate machine bypasses the public square. It doesn't need to win the argument. It just needs to change the background music of your daily life. And Amazon's reach makes this effortless. One platform, millions of purchases, billions of psychological impressions. Leavitt, standing at that podium, understood this better than most. She wasn't just challenging a price display, she was confronting a meta-narrative, a new form of subtle authoritarianism where corporate tech giants frame reality while pretending to stay neutral. Peterson calls it the velvet rope of ideology. Soft, elegant, unassuming, dumb, but ultimately binding. When corporations decide what truth is palatable and what emotion to attach to it, he says, the free individual becomes a curated mind. It's not just about this one instance with tariffs. It's about setting a precedent. If Amazon can frame your economic perspective this easily, what else can they do? What if they begin itemizing climate fees next, or diversity surcharges, or equity adjustments, all under the banner of transparency, all in service of a broader ideological message? People think authoritarianism wears a uniform, Peterson says. But in the modern age, it wears a smile and offers free 2-day shipping. What we're witnessing, then, isn't just a pricing change. It's a test, a signal, a quiet declaration that corporate power now feels entitled to shape not just your consumption, but your conclusions. And unless we reclaim the right to interpret data ourselves, to assign meaning without corporate handholding, we risk becoming a society that is not only guided, but groomed. Autonomy begins, Peterson says, when you stop letting the powerful decide what you're allowed to notice. Karoline Leavitt didn't stop at tariffs. She went further, much further, and touched a nerve Amazon hoped the media would ignore: its documented relationship with the Chinese Communist Party. At the press podium, she dropped the bomb. Amazon has partnered with a Chinese propaganda arm. That's not a conspiracy theory. That's a matter of public record. And she was right. Reuters had already reported that Amazon, in order to operate freely within China, had agreed to promote Chinese state-published books, suppress unfavorable reviews of political materials, and even disable comments on Xi Jinping's publications. Jordan Peterson immediately zeroed in. You cannot claim moral authority about price transparency in America while censoring dissent in a dictatorship. It's more than hypocrisy. It's ideological contradiction. Amazon, a company that claims to value transparency and democracy, willfully complied with autocratic demands in exchange for market access. And now it wants to appear righteous by educating Americans about tariff costs. Peterson didn't mince words. That's not transparency. That's strategy. It's postmodern relativism weaponized at a global scale. Truth when it's profitable, silence when it's not. This is the fundamental contradiction Peterson has warned about for years, that powerful institutions will adopt whatever ethical mask fits the moment and discard it just as quickly. In China, Amazon was a silent partner to censorship. In America, it's a loud voice for clarity. Corporations have no permanent loyalty to principles, Peterson said, only to power. And in this case, the power lies in shaping Western perception. When a company that willingly suppresses free speech in one hemisphere starts preaching economic virtue in another, it's not practicing honesty, as it's managing optics. Leavitt's revelation put a spotlight on the selective morality Amazon plays with. The platform that once disabled reviews for Chinese propaganda now wants to be your guide to trade policy. Peterson's conclusion was clear. If you're willing to comply with totalitarian censorship abroad, don't lecture free citizens at home about what they need to see. In essence, this wasn't just about tariffs or consumer protection. It was about credibility. And as Peterson put it, the moment a company becomes a tool of two masters, profit and propaganda, the truth is no longer its product. When Karoline Leavitt spoke out, some called her courageous, others called her combative. But regardless of which side of the aisle they were on, everyone reacted. Because Leavitt's statement wasn't just a policy critique, it was a litmus test, a mirror, a Rorschach ink blot held up to the American psyche. How you respond to Karoline Leavitt's outrage, Jordan Peterson said, reveals what you actually believe about power, truth, and female leadership. And indeed, the media's reaction was swift and predictable. Headlines accused her of being emotional, reactionary, or playing politics. But few dared to challenge the core of what she said, part because the facts weren't up for debate. Peterson was quick to draw a broader conclusion. When a man speaks with conviction, they call it strength. When a woman does it, they call it hysteria. He pointed out the selective outrage from pundits who dismissed Leavitt's tone while ignoring Amazon's massive global influence or the implications of their tariff stunt. Leavitt didn't lash out, Peterson said. She laid out a chain of logic. The only reason it felt aggressive was because she didn't ask for permission to speak the truth, and that's what made her stand powerful and dangerous to her critics. In a political climate obsessed with tone policing and emotional optics, Leavitt's message cut through the noise. She spoke not as a partisan firebrand, but as someone refusing to play by the unspoken rules of corporate diplomacy. She refused to sanitize the truth, Peterson said. And that's a revolutionary act in an era where institutions prefer comfort over honesty. Leavitt's framing of Amazon as a politically weaponized force shook the status quo because she didn't treat it as a tech company. She treated it as an ideological actor. And that's exactly how Peterson has long described institutions that merge economic reach with cultural influence. When power masks itself as convenience, Peterson warned, you need voices like Leavitt's to disrupt the spell. The moment wasn't just political, it was archetypal, a single voice against a giant, a woman demanding accountability from $1 trillion empire, a symbolic strike against institutional cowardice masquerading as neutrality. You know you've struck a nerve, Peterson said, when your tone becomes more controversial than the truth you revealed. In the end, Leavitt's stand wasn't about Amazon alone. It was about truth in an age of filtered narratives, about the courage it takes to speak plainly, and the cost of doing so. Peterson summed it up simply. If the price of honesty is outrage, then outrage is cheap. There's a kind of madness that seeps in when truth becomes a moving target. Jordan Peterson has spoken often about the psychological toll of living in a society where institutions distort reality, not through lies, but through carefully managed narratives. And in Amazon's tariff stunt, he saw a textbook case of what he calls soft gaslighting by design. When reality is bent, slowly, subtly, and persistently, the individual begins to question their own perception, he said. Imagine being told over and over that your rising costs are because of government tariffs, when in fact those same platforms were silent during 2 years of historic inflation, labor shortages, and broken supply chains. Now suddenly they want to start itemizing blame. Peterson argues this creates cognitive dissonance, the kind of internal conflict where your lived experience doesn't match the official narrative being pushed by those in power. You begin to feel like you're going crazy, he said, because the world being described to you doesn't match what you actually see. This slow erosion of clarity leads to something more dangerous than anger. It leads to helplessness, a condition Peterson has spent years warning against. When individuals feel that their understanding is constantly undermined, he explains, they lose faith not just in institutions, but in themselves. This is the true cost of what Amazon tried to do. It wasn't just a deceptive pricing stunt. It was an assault on internal agency, on the average citizen's right to form their own conclusions based on honest information. Leavitt's fiery response then wasn't just political pushback. It was an act of psychological resistance. Peterson compared it to a patient finally confronting the abuser in a dysfunctional system. When someone finally names the manipulation out loud, it breaks the trance. It returns sanity to those who were beginning to doubt their own instincts. That's why Leavitt's clarity was so important, because in a world of curated headlines and staged outrage, the simple act of saying what everyone sees but no one dares to name is revolutionary. And for Peterson, it's a reminder that emotional health in society isn't just about access to therapy, it's about access to reality. A society built on illusion cannot sustain healthy minds, he warns. Truth, especially uncomfortable truth, is the precondition for psychological strength. Amazon's pricing stunt may have been subtle, but its impact on the collective psyche could have been profound had it gone unchallenged. Fortunately, it wasn't. If there's one theme Jordan Peterson returns to time and time again, it's this: personal responsibility is the antidote to tyranny. But what happens when institutions teach you to do the opposite, to externalize all blame, to see yourself as a powerless victim of forces beyond your control? That's exactly what he saw in Amazon's tariff stunt. When a corporation tells you this is the government's fault, it's not just pointing fingers, it's shaping your moral posture, Peterson said. It's training you to look outward instead of inward. And that, he argues, is philosophically corrosive. In a healthy culture, citizens accept a share of responsibility for the policies they support, the leaders they elect, and the economic decisions they make. But if companies like Amazon convince you that every financial inconvenience is someone else's fault, tariffs, taxes, regulations, then you become a passive consumer of outrage, not an active participant in democracy. Peterson calls this the death of moral agency. If you always believe you're being cheated, you'll never believe you have the power to change anything. he said. And that's exactly where manipulators want you: angry, confused, and inert. What makes this tactic even more dangerous is its pseudo-moral veneer. Amazon framed its move as consumer advocacy, a benevolent act of clarity, but in reality it was emotional redirection. They weren't helping people understand economics. They were helping people assign blame, and not to the corporations or to themselves, but to political policies that hurt Amazon's bottom line. Leavitt understood this instinctively. If Amazon really cared about clarity, she said, they'd list all the ways their own pricing policies affect the consumer, not just the ones that align with their political agenda. Peterson likened it to a parent blaming the school system every time their child fails. You're not protecting the child. You're robbing them of resilience, he said. You're teaching them that they are never at fault, never accountable, and never empowered. This is the long game of ideological capture. Teach the masses that everything wrong is someone else's doing, and they'll never rise up to fix anything themselves. Responsibility is hard, Peterson concluded, but it's also the only thing that leads to strength. And any system that discourages it, no matter how transparent it claims to be, is breeding weakness. In that context, Amazon's pricing stunt wasn't just a political maneuver, it was a cultural message. Don't think, don't question, just blame who we tell you to. Fortunately, voices like Leavitt's and minds like Peterson's are still willing to challenge that message no matter how well packaged it is. If Amazon's tariff stunt was just a one-off, it might have faded into the news cycle like so many corporate controversies. But Jordan Peterson sees something more, something broader. This isn't about a receipt. It's about the battle for the cultural narrative. And we're at an inflection point, he warned. In Peterson's eyes, we are entering a new era, one where tech giants, financial institutions, and media conglomerates don't just influence your decisions, but curate your beliefs. Amazon's brief plan to highlight tariff costs may have seemed small, but it represents a fundamental shift. Corporations are no longer just responding to political climates, they're actively trying to shape them. The very platforms we rely on to live, to shop, to communicate, to work, are beginning to function as ideological filters, Peterson said. And when that happens, neutrality dies. It's a chilling thought. What if every online experience is slowly being tuned not just to your preferences, but to someone else's political goals? What if truth becomes personalized? Not to reflect who you are, but to reflect who they want you to become? That's the danger Leavitt exposed, and it's why her message hit so hard, because she didn't just confront a company, she confronted a system where pricing isn't just about economics anymore. It's about influence, sentiment, and steering public emotion. The next battle, Peterson said, won't be fought over policy. It will be fought over perception. And that means the stakes couldn't be higher, because once public trust is eroded and once every communication becomes suspect, truth itself fractures. People retreat into ideological silos, dialogue collapses, and the population becomes easy to control, not through force, but through emotional exhaustion. You can't think clearly when you're always being nudged, Peterson warned. Eventually, you just submit to the narrative that feels least painful. But there's another side to this story. One Leavitt's stand hints at: resistance is still possible. By calling out Amazon's transparency for what it was, a calculated narrative play, she reminded Americans that critical thinking isn't obsolete. It's revolutionary. Peterson echoed that sentiment. You don't need a PhD to know when you're being manipulated. You just need the courage to trust your own judgment again. So what happens next? That depends on whether people wake up or continue scrolling. It depends on whether citizens, journalists, lawmakers, and yes, even other corporations are willing to challenge the creeping normalization of ideological influence masquerading as customer service. This is the fork in the road, Peterson said. We either reassert the value of truth or we become comfortable with curated delusion. Leavitt's firestorm may have been one moment in a week of headlines, but its deeper meaning is clear. The fight for the soul of public discourse has entered the marketplace. And if we let that marketplace become the new battleground for belief, The price tag won't be in dollars, it'll be in freedom. In the end, this wasn't about tariffs, or Amazon, or even Karoline Leavitt. This was about truth, who controls it, who manipulates it, and who dares to speak it plainly when it's no longer convenient. Amazon claimed it was just trying to help consumers, but Jordan Peterson saw through the act. He called it what it was, a performance designed not to inform, but to guide, to steer public emotion, to shift blame, to rewrite perception under the banner of transparency. And when Karoline Leavitt stood up and called it out for what it was, she didn't just challenge a company, she challenged an entire playbook of soft control. You can't outsource moral responsibility to a brand, Peterson reminds us. The price of freedom isn't in your cart, it's in your conscience. So the next time a corporation offers you clarity, ask what it wants in return. Because in the age of weaponized narratives, every line item carries a message. And if we're not careful, we won't just be paying for products. We'll be paying for someone else's version of reality.